The movie is a description and depiction of UN peacekeepers in Bosnia, the way that they participated in and spearheaded the trafficking that took place in post-conflict Bosnia. Now, in order to understand this clip, you need to know that for several months before this film was shown before the United Nations, there were memos going throughout the UN that were about damage control, trying to control the amount of damage that this movie would do to the United Nations reputation, and trying to figure out the right UN strategy to it. Maybe ignoring it, maybe addressing it. Long story short, finally, after the distributors of the movie pointedly asked the UN would they be showing the movie, and if not, then the distributors would let that matter leak to the press, the UN finally put together a panel with many people on it, including Madeleine and the director of the movie, Laryssa Kondracki. So we here are just showing you a very small part of the panel, and at some point during the course of this evening, Madeleine will say something more about the UN response to it.
I'm so grateful and so glad that Laryssa and her team did make this film, because I don't think we would be sitting here having this conversation with the Secretary-General without that impetus. So I think it's very, very important that we are having this conversation today. I came down to watch the last 20 minutes of the film because I've seen it like 5 times, and I actually can't bear to watch it anymore. It gets more difficult every time. And Margaret Wallstrom asked me when I came in, she said, in retrospect, don't you think there was something more, something else you could have done? And that's exactly why I find it so difficult, because every time I watch it, I think, well, we tried this, we tried that, we kept on trying to raise the issue, and we were blocked all the time by the very people that we were trying to work with. And I feel guilty for that. I can't think what else I could have done, but actually having a meeting like this might well have driven a different policy forward. And in fact, the only time that when the peacekeepers left was the only time when the trafficking really went away. And that really is a sad indictment. Everything that happened in the film is true. And I know because I was there. It's true, it didn't happen necessarily to all those characters in those same way, but what you saw happen to the girls in that film did happen. And we'll never know to how many, because we were unable to keep the records. That said, naive idealist I may be, I still firmly believe in the positive nature of human beings. And I really believe that everyone here who saw that film must be deeply moved and touched by it. And if you're deeply moved and touched by it, then that means that we have to keep hold of that emotion, so that when we're talking about what the United Nations and all of us must do to stop this ever, ever happening again, then we're going to be a little bit progressive, a little bit brave, and we're going to really exercise ourselves in making sure that there are no excuses, there are no hiding behind institutions, and that there's real accountability. I was very glad to hear from the Secretary-General about the institutional changes that are being made, and also very glad to hear about the mention of how law must be used to regulate conduct. This we know, but I have real grave reservations about how it's going to work without there being this institutional change that was referred to. Great to have a theoretical framework of accountabilities. Very important to have zero tolerance, but I would say that that existed in Bosnia at the time that I was there. Everybody had to sign the form, everybody had to do the paperwork and actually commit to not committing crimes in somebody else's country. Did they read it before they signed it, or did they think it wasn't relevant, or did it just not matter because, quite simply, there was going to be no accountability anyway? In any event, those regulations did exist, but they were not enforced. And one of the reasons I think they were not enforced is because of this, what is now termed this culture of hegemonic masculinities, which is essentially, once you get on mission, you're all one of the lads, and it doesn't matter what we do because we'd all muck in together and cover for each other. And it comes from leadership. The first time I started raising the issue of trafficking at the senior meeting, there was giggling around the table. I don't know whether it was embarrassed because we were talking about sex, but there was giggling around the table. When I kept raising it and raising it and raising it, they got very bored with my raising it and actually told me off for continuing to raise it. And I was very lucky because I worked for the Office of the High Commissioner and had an independent reporting line. If I had not had an independent reporting line, I would have been out of the United Nations much more quickly than has happened hitherto. And that's because we had a human rights expert in Mary Robinson who was backing me completely and wanted us to make the changes and fighting to make sure that the United Nations upheld the highest standards to which it must be accountable. So we need a change in culture. We need to do it through training, through awareness, through having gender advisors in the missions, yes, but giving them sufficient numbers and authority and level to be able to make that difference. We can't say that there is that it's just a few rotten apples that would cause the sort of devastation that took place in Bosnia. You've only got to look at the economic consequences that were for Bosnia as a result of peacekeepers paying massive amounts of money into organised crime to know that it wasn't just a few rotten apples. Rotten apples can only be tolerated if the institution tolerates. So it goes back. Training pre-deployment, training, awareness, monitoring, absolutely fundamental. I think the other thing that absolutely must kick into place is a much more intense and better understanding of international law. This took place in Bosnia. And one of the reasons why the peacekeepers came into Bosnia, why the world became so agonized about Bosnia, was because of the reports of the rape and torture of women in that country. One case that was very, very famously reported on is that of Foča, where the accused kept women in exactly the same state as women who were trafficked. And they were found guilty of crimes against humanity, particularly for slavery. I actually assisted in preventing the prosecution of a woman for prostitution and illegal entry who had had exactly the same experience as those women. But she had been abused by the international community in so-called peacetime. And so she was the victim of the prosecution. Now, how ridiculous is that? That really does make law look as if it is really not working on behalf of the people it really must be working for. So we need to change that. What we need to be looking at is how do we apply international humanitarian law and human rights law to those people who are going to other people's countries to serve and look after, protect those persons, particularly from a gender perspective. And that means that we need to absolutely insist that the troop contributing countries and those who provide the police exert the highest standards in recruitment. That we do ensure that there is no possibility of any member state who is not transparently having real procedures with real teeth, real investigations, real prosecutions. We ensure that they do not get to send police or troops. And we cannot, under any circumstances, exclude them for any jurisdiction from organisations like the International Criminal Court. Otherwise, what are we doing? We are saying, you stay in your own country and you commit crimes of this nature, and let us not underestimate what these crimes are. They are just cogent under international law. We're talking rape, we're talking abuse of sexual violation of children, and we're talking slavery. How can it be that people who commit those crimes can walk away? So what we absolutely must insist upon is that the troop contributing countries have those systems in place, that they enforce it, that they are transparent and they are monitored, and if they don't do that, they do not come. And we cannot subordinate that to political expediency. Yes, it's important to have peacekeepers, but if we have peacekeepers who are violating the rights and even the lives of the women and children in those countries, then they are doing not just a disservice to the United Nations, but they must be fully brought to account. Thank you.
Obviously, in that clip, I'm talking about Bosnia. I'm talking about what happened in Bosnia. It's important to remember three, I think, very, very vital ingredients about trafficking in this context. Trafficking is about extreme capitalism. It's about the market. It's about where you can move things to make money. In Bosnia, the people who became involved in moving the people were the same people who'd been involved in moving the guns, the drugs, the food, everything during the conflict, wonderfully multi-ethnic. Once the conflict stopped, they needed a new market. 60,000 peacekeepers with an addition of 20,000 civilians arrived in end of 95, 1996, with lots of money in their pockets, and the vast majority of them men. And at the same time, you have in Eastern Europe what had been sort of state-run economies hitting the wall of free market capitalism and collapsing. And so you had extreme poverty in places like Moldova, where people who had been on reasonable middle incomes were suddenly hit and having incomes of less than $30 a month to survive on. As a result, you have this incredible juxtaposition of a lot of impoverished people, women, who needed to migrate to make money to send remittances home. At the same time, you have this massive market evolving in Bosnia. In the context where there is a massive amount of money that's come in, it doesn't take a genius to work out what those guys who were doing the illegal trading during the conflict would then turn their minds to doing. In a context where the legal situation is such that there is no rule of law, there is no one to enforce it, the borders are completely porous, and you have a domicile population which has got its own traumas to deal with and is not looking to see what is happening in terms of people being brought over, sexual exploitation. In that context, what you have is essentially an international force that have the freedom of movement. There were curfews on the national population. The cars, really, there was no infrastructure. The only cars on those streets were really those belonging to the international community. Certainly those that were traveling across country were from the international community. And only those who could cross were actually endorsed by or had some sort of certification from the international community if they came across quasi-legally. So you've ended up with a market which is developing, absolutely no legal regulation of it whatsoever, and a domicile population that really is not paying attention to what's happening because it's got its own concerns and priorities. And there's chaos. Now, in that such a situation, it's like the perfect storm for what would be, what I think is now really the microcosm of what trafficking is. If you look at how trafficking works in other contexts, when you have this sort of post-conflict situation, it is absolutely where all the things come together. At the same time, you've got this complete neglect by the international community of what's happening, and then you have a response which over time gradually evolves, but from an institutional perspective, which doesn't actually do the most important thing, and that is actually tracing it back to what is it that's happened from the beginning of the trafficking cycle to the end of the trafficking cycle, not from the perspective of the market or the perspective of the international response, but from the perspective of the people who really understand it, and that's the women who've been through it. And what I hope we're going to discuss is how that different perspective plays out in terms of the responses there should have been and must be if we're going to prevent it again.
I wanted to start out by asking about when you first arrived in Bosnia, because I think sadly we now all expect when peacekeepers go to a post-conflict situation there's going to be trafficking. But could you tell us, when you arrived in Bosnia in 1997, were you aware of the existence of trafficking or the possibility of it? Had you already been alerted to it, or was it not yet on your radar screen and something you had to unfortunately find out about?
Absolutely not at all. I had not gone to Bosnia thinking there'd be trafficking, but how naive was that? It was the first time I'd been in any sort of peacekeeping mission. I'd actually gone there independently in 1996, and I was hearing rumours then, because I was friendly with a lot of I'd gone to talk with the women's groups, and one of them was a judge, and she said to me, we've got this bizarre situation where I have these women who come to me on a regular basis, like once a month, and I have to prosecute them as prostitutes because it's illegal. Still is illegal in Bosnia to be a prostitute. So they were coming before her. The police had rounded them up, and then she had to, because it's a strict liability offence, she had to find them and send them off. Because they were foreigners, they couldn't then stay in the canton, so they had to be escorted by the police into the next canton and dumped, basically, or dumped over the border. And then a few months later, they'd be back again. And so she's saying, what is this? Because she never got the chance to talk to them. She just saw this was going on. And then that led to me to start thinking, this looks like. And then we started talking with other women's organizations. There were similar things going on. And then I raised it during a training with the International Police Task Force Human Rights Monitors, and they're saying, I have been told that there are foreign women who are being prosecuted as prostitutes. And then the men just said, Yeah, we know, and you know where the brothels are because all the UN cars are outside. And so that was the first real inkling we had. And then when I became the head of the office of the High Commissioner, we then convened the first meeting on it in 1998, just before Christmas. And they brought the social workers, police, NGOs, and started discussing what was going on. And it became clear that it was actually a huge problem. And there were locations all over Bosnia where this was actually happening. So no, I hadn't anticipated working on it. And in a way, I ended up having to spend so much of my time working on trafficking when we should, all of us, have been concentrating on working with the domicile population and the traumas that we were there supposed to try and help them to overcome. Instead of that, we had to deal with this. So we came in, we created a problem, then some of us had to spend time fixing the problem that we'd created instead of working on the real issues that should have been concentrated on.
So Madeleine, draw the connections. You keep referring to the trauma of the domicile population, and that, I assume, refers to the rape camps and the genocide that had occurred in Bosnia. We're seeing exactly the same phenomenon right now in Democratic Republic of Congo, and to some extent under slightly different circumstances in Haiti. So is there a connection between some sort of aggressive, violent, even murderous sort of masculinity that's taking place in any place, whether it's because of civil conflict or because of an earthquake or because of religious or ethnic violence? Is there a connection between pre-existing aggressive violence towards women and then, with the addition of international peacekeepers or an international presence, that somehow has an elixir to it that becomes what you call the perfect storm? What's happening there?
I think that there is a connection, and I wouldn't say it's where there has been a tradition of violence against women. I think it is more than that. It is where there is a militarization process, because there is then a complete shift in the way in which the dynamics between men and women work, or at least the perception. And there's been a lot of research done on masculinities and how that works. And if you look at the situation in Bosnia, where there was de jure, if not de facto, equality in the former Yugoslavia, we were saying today earlier about the role that women played in the former Yugoslavia was they were the fighter pilots, they were the heads of the banks, they dominated the medical profession. So there wasn't quite this inequality that some now seem to sort of try to interpret into the Bosnian context.
And that was because in the former Soviet Union there was at least formal, substantive gender equality.
Absolutely. So there were, of course, there were gender stereotypes, and of course there were things that were unequal, but it was not as it was portrayed during the conflict. During the conflict, I mean, without going into the whole history of it, but one anecdote which I think says it all was that as things were building up to the conflict, the women were noticing that the men were behaving differently, that they started drinking in different bars, that they started supporting different football clubs, and they started sort of diversity, moving away and starting to polarize into their ethnic groups. For some considerable time, the women were trying to avoid that. They were kept on going to the markets together, trading with each other, conducting their lives as they had tried to before. And then it was said, and there's one particular village up in Visegrad, the rumor that a woman had been raped. And once that happened, that was it. The polarization was more or less complete, because the men then started saying, now we've got to protect you. And so that sort of drove the ethnic groups even further apart. And in retrospect, some of the women say, we're not sure that actually happened. But it was great as a way of dividing us. It was great as a tool for actually saying, now we are the women who need to be protected, and our men have to protect us, which accelerated this division. So what you've ended up with was a complete gender polarization. And of course women did fight, and of course there were men who didn't fight, and all those sort of individual stories. But in general terms, that's what happened. And it was particularly virulent because it was the convicted criminals that were unleashed by Milosevic to go and be the militias. It wasn't the regular forces coming in, it was the militias who had gone there to terrorize the population, who perpetrated the worst of the atrocities. And once that's happened, then basically the plot's been lost, because everybody is all over the place, and the laws of war will not be respected, and you have what we had in Bosnia. as a follow-up from that, you then send in the troops. And the troops almost, I mean, there were the UN troops there during the conflict, and they were not respected because they didn't do their job. They had in their defense, they had a hopeless mandate, but at the same time, there's enough information about some of the things that the racketeering they got into. They controlled the airport, there was black marketeering, there was smuggling of oil. There were all sorts of things that were not done correctly. But what again, you have this sort of a very military post-conflict situation where there's lots of men with uniforms and guns and tanks who are driving around the streets, as opposed to the other men with the guns and the military who are driving around the streets. And it did lead to this sort of, I think, a sort of a real gender polarization, which continued. And it's interesting that I think that with the trafficking that happened, the real change in the approach that the domicile population, the Bosnians, had toward what was happening was when the story was broken by a journalist in Bosnia, writing in a regular magazine. She'd investigated what was happening. And she said that when she talked to the women in the cafe bars, the night bars, who were all supposed to be foreign prostitutes serving foreign men, so nobody cared, she looked into their eyes and she'd done investigations in the rape camps, and she said it was the same. They were exactly the same as the women I'd interviewed from the rape camps. And they're not prostitutes. And that changed things fundamentally, because then the Bosnian population realized that they were seeing basically a recreation of what had happened in that situation. That doesn't really answer your question, because what I think is why I've spent time on that part is I think that is replicated when you have a situation of chaos like you have had in Haiti or we have in the DRC, where the rule of law is gone. So basically, you can act when you're UN, you can more or less act with some form of impunity anyway, because you have this functional immunity. Put that into a situation where there's no law in any case. Put that in a situation where it is, again, the gender dimensions of crises tend to put the male as the subject and the female as the victim in need of protection, despite all the rules and regulations we've now got from Security Council Resolution 1325 onwards. And you get this sort of perception of roles that must be played. And with the perception that roles must be played, especially with the militarization, is you get this concept of, we're in control, we are the powerful ones, we can do what we like. And that's what we saw in Bosnia, that's what we've seen in Haiti, that's what's going on in DRC. And it is to do with this sort of closed shop part of the team.
I understand that, but as a follow-up, how does this lowered respect for women then translate into the use of women as an object that can be sold across time and space? So how do we get from the woman who's used as a sexual object in a local bar to then someone who's loaded into a car and sent off somewhere and sold? What's different about that scenario? How does that happen? How does the trafficking emerge out of this complete lack of respect for women because of the aggressive militarization of masculinity?
The latter part is the market. Then you've got the entrepreneurs. They're the ones who are doing the transportation. And the reason the transportation has to happen fairly quickly is that you don't want women in one place for any length of time.
Why not?
Because it might well be that they will form a bonding with the local community if they're allowed out. Or it may be, and this happens several times, that you will have clients who will come in and think, actually, these aren't prostitutes. We need to do something. Mm-hmm. We had guys who did buy women to set them free. Or we had a little drop box. They could tell us where they knew there were things going wrong, and some did actually use that. You don't want that. You also get women who will form friendships amongst the community of women in the bar, and they will try to find ways of either getting out or assisting each other. You don't want that. You've got to break it. So you sell them on to the next bar, move them all the time. That way it's more difficult to learn the language, difficult to find ways of escaping. You're constantly without any form of reference whatsoever, because you never know what you're getting to next. And in many cases, they didn't know what country they were in, because they would tell them who were being transported from one part of Bosnia to the next, they were now in Italy. And they wouldn't know necessarily that they weren't in Italy. So this great way of actually removing that person from their own perspective. They don't know who they are, where they are, what they're doing. And it's brilliant because it means you are completely in control. And then if they do escape, the only phone number they've got is that of their trafficker. So of course, on some occasions, you would have women who would call their trafficker to say, now I'm in a shelter, what do I do now? What do I do now? You know? So it's a very good way of making sure you keep control. It also makes you tons of money because every time you sell on, you make some money. And then if you start doing it cross-border, then you make even more money, especially if you're giving the opportunity to sell on to Western Europe because the price goes up.
What sort of money are we talking about?
In Bosnia at that time, you could buy a woman for $1,000, and there was a real market. There was an actual slave market where they would bring the women on, and according to height, looks, hair length, breast size, you'd pay a price for the age, you know, yeah, and that was in the Arizona market up in the north of Bosnia. So you could pay, and it's dead easy because there's nothing to stop you. You go pay your money, take your woman back to your little local cafe shop. Lots of cafe shops had like 2 women upstairs. And then you could just pay, the internationals would pay 100 marks for sex, and the nationals, when that started, would pay about 30. So you would do the math, you know, in a day, you've made back your investment, and the rest is pure profit. And interesting enough, we were really worried when we first started doing the assistance programs. We were really worried about the security issues. Because we thought, how are we going to, you know, if women run away or if they come to us for help, and we didn't have any money or anything, we were putting up in this little sort of like a hotel, which we then sent people to walk around to make sure it was safe. We thought they're bound to come after them, but nobody bothered.
Why not?
It's not worth it. They're not going to testify because they've already been told if they testify or say anything, then they'll be killed, their family be killed, whatever. And the punishments that did happen to those that did get caught back up into trafficking were horrific, as the film realistically depicts. And it's so cheap, you know. Why waste time trying to get her if she's going to be a problem anyway? All that's going to happen is they're going to deport her. So go buy another one. And that existed for 2 or 3 years until the rule of law started to kick in, and there was this response from the Bosnian community, and the local police started to move in. We started to get traction from the Ministry of Human Rights and Refugees to start making a difference, and we started having regulations in place. But it didn't, as I said on the thing, it didn't actually stop until the market moved, because the entrepreneurs are playing with the market all the time. They can see how it's evolving. So it goes from extemporized by extreme violence in the early days with the use of, you know, raping and beating, attack dogs, guns, the whole bit, to, by the end of the phase, you go through this, going through the grey economy, to almost legal brothels where it's almost decent, where there is a bed instead of just the floor to have sex on, where the women would be paid something, not a huge amount, but they would be paid something, and eventually, having paid off their debt, they would be allowed to go home. So the whole thing really transmogrifies from the extreme black economy into sort of grey and then almost legal. And some of the bar owners then put on their suits and started talking to the international communities as successful businessmen. You know, it's how it happens.